Hey everyone, thank you for joining me. So today's knife that I will be customizing is the Spyderco Yojimbo 2. I love this knife. I think it's a great knife by Spyderco. But as you guys can see, there's really nothing done to it. However, I do have these Flytanium titanium scales. I need to re-anodize them because definitely has seen some use. As you guys can tell, I like to use this knife, but definitely needs an upgrade, and that is exactly what I'll be doing today. So here is the material. Now this is I want to say it's America or American from Camo Carbon. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. Excited to use it. Now the only thing with creating scales for the Yojimbo 2 is that there are recessed liners, which is something I still need to figure out on the CNC. As you can see here, I have the originals, and there's the inlays, or that's where they go, so they get set inside of the scale. So what I'm going to do to get around that is actually thin these down to the point where I remove just about that much material there, exposing this, so basically this will be empty. And then what I'm going to do is glue the original G10 scales onto the new material, and then I'm actually just going to cut around. It's going to make it a lot easier, and I'll show you guys in the customization part of the video. So let's just get right to it, and I'll see you guys down in the shop. One thing I really do like about the Yojimbo 2 is that there's not too much hardware, and it's fairly simple to take apart, and that's why I really enjoy customizing this knife as well. I set up my drill press with a pretty large milling bit. So what I'm going to do right now is just manually mill the original scales, thin them down. That way when I epoxy the Camo Carbon to them, they're not going to be thick and chunky scales. Now I'm just cutting off a smaller piece from the larger slab of Camo Carbon. That way it's just a lot easier to work with, and also I'm not going to waste as much material. Next thing I'll be doing is taking some 5-minute epoxy, which obviously takes a lot longer to fully set, but I do like that it sets faster. I'm mixing it really well, and before I slathered on the epoxy onto the scale and material, I made sure to score the material and the scales with a razor blade, just so that the epoxy has something to bond to really, really well. And then I also added something heavy to smash that down and get it nice and flat. So over here, what I did was I marked some lines with a ruler. That way I have a nice guide to kind of focus on when I am cutting these in half, and also making sure not to cut into my scales and just keeping it really, really tight. Now I'm taking the roughly cut out scales over to the table grinder, and I'm going to get as close as I can to the original G10 scales. That way it's a lot easier on the router once I get there. Now I'll be focusing on drilling out the hardware holes. And as you guys know, Spyderco has a 4-way position setup for the pocket clip. I like to eliminate all of those and focus on just the right hand side. But one thing I do like about epoxying the original scales onto a new material is you just flip it over and you can drill out the hardware holes that you need. So there is a plus to doing it this way. Now, after drilling out the hardware holes, I will focus on countersinking those hardware holes. That way the screws can sit down just low enough to actually screw into the barrel spacers. And another thing this allows me to do is get a rough idea of how much to thin down the scales. That way it just looks really, really good when it's all assembled. Now I had some extra Yojimbo 2 scales lying around, so I will be using those as a template for the next step. I went ahead and installed the show side scale, to use as a template going around this router bit. Now this allows me to get as close as I can to the original scale without really touching it. So it makes my life a lot easier when I'm going to be hand sanding it. So after doing that on both sides, I'll install both of the new scales, take it over to my vise, and then I'll use a variety of grit sandpaper to get it as close as I can to the G10 scales, and then I'll finish it with a finer grit so it looks really, really good, as you guys can see right here. So I went ahead and took a break from the scales, and I'll be focusing on reshaping my blade with a very aggressive harpoon shape, which I think looks really good on the Yojimbo 2, as you can see here. Now I like to keep water on the side when I'm doing this, just so I don't overheat the blade. Now from there, I'm going to be taking my Dremel with my smallest sanding drum and creating that really cool rock pattern texture that I really like on the spine of a blade. Not only does it look cool, but it also feels really, really good in hand. And I will be doing a how-to video on this eventually, but as you guys can see here in just a moment, it came out really well. I think I used 320 grit on my sanding drum. That way you can still see the grain, but you also get a really nice reflection from that finish. And I even touched up the bottom of the blade here, but more on that when I assemble it later in the video. Now what I'm doing is going back to the scales and creating some chamfered guidelines, because I really want this thing to stand out in different angles. So I matched up as best I could on both sides. Now I'm taking my Dremel and taking out just as much material as I can without going past my guidelines. Now this is one step you really want to take your time with, and definitely don't want to go past your guidelines. But once a rough shape is in place and enough material is removed, I'll take it over to my vise and I'll use various tools to wrap my sandpaper around. That way I can get a really nice flat chamfer or beveled edge. And not only that, but it comes out a lot cleaner. It's a lot more even on both sides. And through this process, I'm constantly checking it back and forth just to make sure both sides are where they need to be and even. So really happy with it. I really like to finish my Camo Carbon or my Fat Carbon with 320 grit. I think it brings out the most shine without making it too shiny or too flat. All right, so we are back up in the studio, and I'm going to give you guys a close look at what I created. We'll start off with the scales. Now I used the America Camo Carbon material. So you guys can see it's got the red, white, and blue, which I thought was fitting for the 4th of July. As you guys saw in the video, I did manually mill the original G10 scales. I thinned them down, and then I epoxied the Camo Carbon on top, which this works surprisingly well. I haven't had any issues in the past, and I'm happy that I am able to go this route, because if I was to manually mill this out, it would just take too long. I did bevel the edges. I did create just kind of a different look to it to expose the material at a different angle. I gave it a large bevel here in the front, so when you do a pinch grip, it feels a lot better in hand. And then I put I guess a feathered beveled edge here. So it's a lot larger here in the front, and then it fades away here towards the bump. Then down here where your fingers land when you're gripping it, I did have a hard line, but I didn't like how it felt in hand, so I actually just kind of rounded it off into the flat section of the scale. This is the show side. Obviously you don't have that cut out for the compression lock, so this one was a lot easier, but very time consuming to do those beveled edges, but it does pay off and it comes out really, really clean. Next up, we will go to the blade, which I am really happy with. Now this one I did a light etch. I didn't leave it in the Ferric Chloride too long, and I gave it a very aggressive stone wash. Now, I created this rock pattern texture after I etched, and I was a little skeptical because I didn't want to etch it and then let's say I did slip and I cut into the etch, I would have to re-etch it and then restart, but that didn't happen. The one thing that did happen, and it's a little frustrating, is that sanding drum on the Dremel. So the glue, I guess, came off. There's too much heat and it kind of had like a flapping tip, if that makes any sense, and it kind of scratched it. So I'm a little bummed out that that happened, but it kind of matches with that stone wash. Other than that, it turned out really well. I also gave it a sharpening choil, gave it a fresh, aggressive cutting edge, and really happy with the harpoon or reshape of the blade. So I will do a video eventually on how to do this rock pattern texture on the spine of the knife. I also created that rock pattern texture on certain areas underneath, and then I also removed quite a bit of material here so that you don't hit your finger when you bring it down on the compression lock. And I'll show you guys that as well when I assemble it. But just be careful if you guys do end up doing something like this really close to the track of the ball detent. Just be very, very cautious, because I did it on my Pilar. This is the Pilar 3, but right here under the finger choil I did it, but I dug too deep, and now that detent will actually fall into that little texture that I created. If you can see it right there, it basically has a half stop, which is ridiculous. So just keep that in mind. Always be careful if you're going to be doing something to your blade. And then I created a custom pocket clip out of blue G10, which, again, I've mentioned this in other videos. G10 works really well as a pocket clip. Obviously, if you overextend it, it snaps, but it's actually fairly strong. I've had no issues with it. But then again, I'm not getting crazy with my pocket knives, so it does hold up. And then last but not least, I did create a custom backspacer out of white G10 with that same rock pattern texture. Now this was a last minute decision. I really wanted to make a red G10 backspacer, but I didn't have any red G10, so I just decided to go with the white. Really happy with it. And luckily, I created basically another Yojimbo. This is my own personal Yojimbo that I did the harpoon. Basically kind of same setup, but I was able to use this backspacer that I created back a while back and just use it as a template. It made things a lot easier. But I'll leave a video up to this build up here in the corner. You guys can check it out if you haven't seen it already, but really happy with this build. And I do actually have a video on how to make a custom pocket clip out of carbon fiber or G10. Works the same way, but again, I'll leave that up in the corner as well if you guys want to know how to make your own custom pocket clip. That's pretty much it. Oh, one more thing. I did create a satin finish on all the hardware. As you can see, shifts in the light, and I think it'll add a very starry effect. And I think it'll fit very well with the whole theme. So let's put this thing together and see what it looks like. All right, so here it is all assembled. I'm gonna give you guys a close look all the way around. Here's what it looks like closed. There it is with the backspacer. Even when it's closed, you can see the rock pattern texture on the bottom side of the blade to go with that backspacer. It's just hard to get it in that light, but there you go. You guys can see that texture. And then here's the spine of the knife, and then the pocket clip side. Now, I'm not 100% happy with the pocket clip. I might redo it, just make another one. It does function beautifully. I do like the look of it, but there's some small details that I'm not too happy with. Another thing I really like about G10 is you can actually see the layers here, which expose, especially if you are creating contours and certain shapes on it, it does expose those layers. It does look good in the light, so it just really complements the Camo Carbon. Let's check it out opened up, and the action is amazing, just as it was before. If you guys have handled a Yojimbo, you guys know what I'm talking about. But there it is, just really, really mean looking. I love a harpoon, so I was like, I have to do it on all my Yojimbos because I just think it looks more aggressive. And yeah, that's kind of what I'm going for with this knife, is just aggressive. And then also the 4th of July theme. As always, you guys, let me know down below what you guys think of how this thing turned out. And the drop shot action on this thing is really, really good. And all these screws are super tight. And believe it or not, this thing is perfectly centered. I don't know how that happened. I mean, that's really hard to do on the first try. But every time I've assembled it, it's been perfectly centered. So I couldn't be happier. Action is just stupid smooth. I love the Yojimbo knife itself. It's just a great design. I need to get that mini one. I think it would look really cool to customize. And I made sure to really take my time on the compression lock access section here, the cutout. I even beveled it slightly, just a little bit, all the way around. That way when your finger goes in there, it's just nice and comfortable, and there's no sharp, weird, pointy things bothering your finger. Really quick, let's see if my sharpening skills are up to par. But yeah, it is. I made sure it was razor sharp. Again, like I mentioned in past videos, I do like my cutting edge to be aggressive, just that it bites into the material. That's just a personal preference, but very, very sharp, and this thing is ready to go. But there it is, you guys, the 4th of July theme, very custom Yojimbo 2. As always, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you guys on the next one.